Morning. Welcome to the North Pacific LCC Science Management Webinar. I'm Mary Mahaffey, Science Coordinator for the North Pacific LCC, and today's presenter is Dr. Meade Krosby, a research scientist from the University of Washington. The North Pacific LCC provided funding for a project in 2012 because it helped implement our science strategy, and support was also provided by the Great Northern LCC. Both LCCs focus on helping natural and cultural resource managers integrate climate change into management decisions, and this provides a level view that identifies important riparian areas like biological climate change. So it's a very important project for both LCCs. We're pleased to offer this opportunity for me to talk about our project, and thank you for today's webinar. So we're recording today's webinar, and it's going to be posted on our website within approximately a week. And we're trying to globally mute all participants during this presentation, but we've had some technical problems with our phones this morning, and so we're on a phone that is not responding to global mute. So if everybody can please individually mute your phone, and then we're going to have a question-answer time at the end of the webinar, and everyone will be able to, and you can unmute your phones at that time, or if we get the global mute to work, we will unmute then. So anyway, I would like to welcome Meade at this time.
Thanks, Mary. So today I'm going to talk about some work that we recently completed to identify high-priority riparian areas for promoting biological resilience to climate change. And I'm going to start out with a little bit of background on the project. Then I'm going to describe our rationale for the approach that we used. I'm going to walk through our methods, share our results, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how these products might be used. And I'm also looking for feedback from you all at the end during questions about how you might use the products, because this is actually just the first part of an ongoing project, and we'd really like feedback from managers, people who might use the products on future improvements to the model and its usability. So there we go. A little bit of background on the project. The WGA Riparian Mapping Project stemmed from a 2012 sort of conceptual pilot project that was conducted by Washington, Idaho, and Oregon Fish and Game and Fish and Wildlife Department. And we were asking how we might incorporate some climate change values into the WGA chat. So for those unfamiliar with that, the WGA chat is the Western Governors Association's crucial habitat assessment tool, and that's just an online system of maps that displays crucial wildlife habitat that's been determined based on some commonly agreed upon definitions across the 16 western states. So there's a west-wide chat, and then many individual states now have their own chat viewer. So the chat was created using current conditions only. So far there's no sort of climate change values or lens applied to it. And this riparian climate corridor analysis I'm going to talk about today was suggested in this early pilot as one way that we might incorporate consideration of climate to the chat. And then over the past year and a half, we actually developed the methods and completed the analysis for the Pacific Northwest. So just a quick note that actually I should give a heads up that while it does consider climate change and it provides a climate lens, it actually doesn't use future climate projections. And so that'll be clear later when I talk about the methods, but just an indicator that we don't necessarily need buy-in projections of future climate to make decisions right now based on what we already have. So really this has been a project in two parts, and the first of the two parts was led by Dave Theobald, Conservation Science Partners, and that analysis identified potential riparian location and condition for the Northwest, and I'll talk only very briefly about what they did. So the report for their work is available. I'll provide a link later for where you can get our products. What I'm mostly going to be talking about is the work that I led here at UW in partnership with Dave Theobald and Brad McRae at the Nature Conservancy, which prioritizes those potential riparian areas to the extent that we expect they might provide some climate adaptation value for wildlife. And again, just briefly, this project was funded by the Washington, Idaho Department of Fish and Wildlife and Fish and Game, the Great Northern and North Pacific LCCs, and Wilberforce Foundation. And here's the study area. It's basically Hydro Region 17, the Pacific Northwest, parts of Montana, and now I'm going to go into sort of our rationale for this work. And so the past several years have actually seen a really rapidly growing interest in methods for identifying priority areas for conservation in a changing climate. In other words, where should we be directing our limited conservation resources, and how might those places differ from those we might have identified if we weren't considering climate change? And riparian areas have frequently been suggested as priority areas for climate adaptation because they're expected to facilitate species range shifts and to provide microclimatic refugia from warming. So they're expected to facilitate range shifts because they span climatic gradients. So riparian areas naturally run along elevational gradients from warmer areas to cooler areas, and for that reason, we think they're going to be a valuable corridor for species that are going to have to move upward as they track shifting areas of climatic suitability as the climate warms. And riparian areas actually already act as important movement corridors, not only for riparian species, but for many upland species that will move into the riparian to cross landscapes. So there's good reason to believe species would actually use riparian areas for dispersal associated with range shifts as well. Riparian areas are also expected to provide microclimatic refugia from warming because they already contain that are significantly more moist and cool than immediately surrounding areas in the uplands. And this is due both to direct cooling from the running water as well as from shading and evaporative cooling from the surrounding vegetation. And then finally, riparian areas should just offer particularly effective conservation umbrellas under climate change for several reasons. So first, they have really high species richness relative to upland areas. So you're already, even if they only benefited riparian species alone, you'd get a lot of bang for your buck. But they actually also provide a lot of habitat for upland species who might use riparian habitats at certain times or for certain parts of their life cycle. And of course, riparian health is directly contributing to the health of the adjacent aquatic habitat. So it's an umbrella for freshwater species as well. And then finally, riparian areas are often the last remaining natural vegetation we have left in really heavily modified areas. So when you're thinking about species having to move out of protected areas and cross some really inhospitable landscapes, riparian areas are often going to be the only thing they really have to get them through those areas and to where they need to go. So despite the recognition of these values of riparian areas for climate change, there's actually been really few approaches developed so far to identify priority riparian areas for climate adaptation. There's really been only a few analyses that have sort of explicitly identified riparian areas for climate change, and all of these analyses just identify essentially a fixed buffer around streams and rivers, and they're essentially using riverine connectivity as like a proxy for riparian connectivity. And so the thing that we wanted to make sure that was recognized and that we took on explicitly in our analysis was the fact that riparian quality is going to be very important to how well they act as conduits for range shifts and provide microclimatic refugia. So we wanted to look at the riparian area itself rather than just assuming a fixed buffer would do the job. So which riparian areas are most likely to promote biological resilience? Well, first of all, we want to make sure we're identifying riparian areas that actually span climatic gradients. We don't necessarily want to be identifying relatively flat riparian areas. We want ones that are running from warm to cool areas so that species can move along them as climate warms. We want riparian areas that have relatively high canopy cover, and this is both because we know that species are more likely to use riparian areas as movement corridors if there is high canopy cover, and also because the high canopy cover will contribute to the microclimatic refugial benefits by cooling. Similarly, we want riparian areas that are relatively wide. So the wider they are, the more likely species are to use them for movement, and they're also more likely to be relatively cool and in good shape. We want ones with relatively low solar insolation or low exposure to solar radiation, again, so that they're relatively cool. And finally, we want ones with a low level of human modification because they're just much more likely to be resilient if they're in good shape. Species are more likely to use them. There's going to be better connectivity along them. So all 5 of these values are things that we're going to be looking for when prioritizing riparian areas for climate change. So how do we actually map these areas? First, we need a base map of potential riparians. What are the areas that we're actually going to be working with and prioritizing? And this is much easier said than done. So those of you familiar with available riparian layers know that there's a lot of inconsistency among available vegetation maps for riparian areas. There's a lot of errors in them and data gaps, and so we didn't want to base our analysis on the available riparian vegetation maps, and we worked with Dave Theobald to develop a map of potential riparian areas that's based on hydrology and geomorphology. And so it's essentially based off of a digital elevation model. Here, the blue areas are the streamlines, and the green areas are the potential riparian area. And really, we're talking about near-stream valley bottoms here, and it's this could be in any kind of condition, and that's what our model then looks at, is saying is incorporating data on the condition of those riparian areas. And so this is really the most I'm going to talk about Dave Theobald's work on this, but again, I'll provide a link later where you can download his report and read the work that they did. Mostly what I'm going to talk about today is how we then use base map to identify the riparian areas that are likely to promote biological resilience to climate change. So there were a number of sort of conceptual and technical challenges associated with doing this. So we want to identify those riparian areas that meet all of those criteria we talked about a minute ago, those 5 parameters. And the first problem we had was figuring out what unit of analysis to use, because it could be anything from looking at a single pixel. This was done, our analysis was 90-meter resolution. We could have prioritized 90-meter cells, or we could have prioritized confluence-to-confluence stretches of riparian, or we could have prioritized entire watersheds. And ultimately what we landed on was prioritizing outlet-to-headwater stretches of potential riparian. So in other words, looking at riparian corridors at watershed scale. That seemed like the minimum sort of ecologically relevant unit, and also pretty relevant to management as well. So here's the outlet for this little watershed, and here are all of our headwaters, and then the red areas here are the potential riparian, the valley, near stream valley bottoms identified by Theobald et al.'s analysis. And here is one individual outlet to headwater stretch of potential riparian. So for that outlet to headwater stretch, we would identify, we would calculate a number of values associated with those 5 parameters. We would calculate first the change in temperature from the outlet to the headwater. We calculate the percent canopy cover, and I guess I should just introduce the data layers here too. So the change in temperature, to measure that, we used PRISM temperature data. It's actually historical PRISM. There's no future projections again in this. And it's downscaled to 90 meters using climate WNA. For canopy cover, we used the National Land Cover data sets, percent canopy cover area. So this is the width of those potential riparian areas, and that came straight off of Theobald's potential riparian layer. Solar insolation, we measured via something called potential relative radiation, which is a unitless measure of solar radiation exposure. That's just an implementation of the Hillshade tool in ARC. And then for level of human modification, we used landscape condition, and this is the layer that was used by the Western Governors Association's Crucial Habitat Assessment tool, so an effort to be consistent with their data layer, since this was meant to potentially be a pilot for that and be incorporated later. And it's basically just the nature serves landscape condition. And so we measured it for each mouth or outlet to headwater stretch in each watershed. And this brings up sort of the next challenge we had. In addition to thinking about unit of analysis, we also had a sort of a challenge of bookkeeping here, because if you're trying to measure these parameters along these outlet to headwater stretches, at higher order streams they're overlapping. So how do you keep track of which riparian area belongs with which outlet to headwater stretch? And so we actually wind up using the flow accumulation tool in ARC. And so essentially here, the bolded areas, this is a streamline. So here would be the outlet, here would be the headwater, and then all of the shaded cells around here are potential riparian. This is the near stream valley bottom. What we did was we basically accumulated the parameter values from the riparian. into the streamline, and so these values would essentially be summed as they drained into the stream.
We have problems. Okay.
Someone needs to mute, I think. Okay, thank you. So essentially the streamline would wind up with the value that was the summed parameter values of all of the attributing riparian cells. And we would then take the average of that. So we would have the average accumulated parameter value for each streamline cell. And then we would use flow length to accumulate those values up the streamline to the headwater, and then took the average. So what we wound up with at the end for each parameter was a single value attributed to the headwater that represented the average of that parameter value across the entire riparian stretch between the outlet and the headwater. Once we had those parameter values, we could calculate an index for each outlet headwater stretch that reflected how much we thought it would contribute to biological resilience under climate change. And so for each stretch, the index looked like this. The change in temperature, and so you can imagine that as the change in temperature from outlet to headwater goes up, in other words, as the gradient goes up, the index increases. Similarly, it increases with increasing canopy cover and increasing riparian width. But then the index goes down. It's penalized as the level of solar exposure goes up and as landscape condition deteriorates. And so actually landscape condition, it's really a 1 over landscape condition value. And so all that you need to remember is that as landscape condition goes down, the index goes down. We also needed to account for scale. So we would get very different values for an outlet to headwater stretch that would be calculated at potentially you could get a very different value at a local scale, like a Huck 12 watershed, versus if you were looking at, for example, the scale of the whole Pacific Northwest. And it was really important to account for scale because these processes are also happening at different scales. So some species might have very limited dispersal distances. They might not need to have as large a range shift as other species. And so you're thinking of some pretty local scale movement needs, whereas other species might be moving at more of a continental scale, and they'll need much larger, longer riparian corridors and larger refugia. And so we wanted to make sure we accounted for that. And so what we did was we calculated this index for outlet to headwater stretches at each nested Huck level. And these Hucks are just hydrologic units. These are just watersheds. And so what that looks like is, for example, here's a small local watershed, a Huck 12. Here is a headwater. Here is a mouth. Here is the potential riparian stretch between it. We calculated the index for this stretch. Then we calculated again for the headwater all the way down to the next mouth for the Huck 10, then down to the mouth of the Huck 8, and onward down to the Huck 4, and then finally all the way out to the ocean. And so we were hoping by doing it this way that we would account for the very different scaled processes that we're trying to facilitate. And I should say, too, that hydrologic region 17 actually goes way up into Canada here. And, of course, we had some data issues at the border where a lot of our data layers are not available in Canada, and there are other inconsistencies, and so we stopped at the border, and this is the ultimate study region that we looked at. Once we calculated the index at each nested Huck level, we averaged it across scales to get the final index. So now I'm going to walk through some of our results in our intermediate products. So first of all, the base layers, again, here's our temperature base layer, prism downscaled to 90 meters. This is the Riparian Area base layer provided by Theobald et al. These are all the potential riparian areas in the Northwest. Here's percent canopy cover from National Land Cover Dataset, and solar insolation calculated as potential relative radiation. And landscape condition, again, and so here the blues and the greens are in better condition, the browns are in poor condition. With those parameters then accumulated to this streamline and then up to the headwaters, we could calculate the index as I described at each Huck scale. So here it is for Huck 12s, calculated again for the 5th field Hucks, 4th field Hucks, 3rd, 2nd, and then down to 1st field Hucks. And so when we get to the scale of the entire Pacific Northwest, you probably notice that we're missing a lot of data in there, and that's because when we get to this scale, all of the headwaters, except enclosed basins, have riparian areas that eventually meet the ocean. And in our area, many of our interior headwaters are much warmer than their cool coastal outlets, and so that gives you a negative change in temperature, and we wanted to make sure that we were only sort of rewarding temperature changes in a single direction, so we weren't sort of stranding things on local temperature minima, and so we essentially did not provide, we didn't include negative index values in the overall calculation, so only where we got a positive score did we include this in the overall value, which was averaged across scales. And here's the final Riparian Climate Corridor Index. And so I should describe a couple of things about what's going on here. So these are, first of all, you'll notice, again, we're looking at these are points, and so because of that overlapping issue, it's very hard to keep track of the values when you get into higher order streams, and so just for ease of interpretation, we just have the data presented as points at the headwater, but you need to realize that this reflects the score of the riparian stretch going from this headwater all the way out to the ocean, or for a closed basin to a sink. We are presenting this in quintiles. The blue areas, these are the top 20% values in the Northwest. Beige areas are the bottom 20% values. Some key patterns, obviously, mountains have very high scores, and that is not particularly surprising for a number of reasons. They have relatively steep climatic gradients. They have relatively high canopy cover. They're relatively well shaded because they have a lot of topographic relief, and relatively low levels of modification because similarly the lowlands have low scores because they're relatively flat, relatively low canopy cover, high levels of solar exposure, and high levels of modification. Also, there are areas here with no scores, and these are just either very arid regions that just don't have a lot of runoff, and or they're very, very permeable soils where, again, there's not a lot of runoff. So if you want to zoom in a little bit, you can see some individual headwaters here at a more local scale. And not surprising, so here's obviously Seattle and the Olympics and Cascades, and you can see you get much higher scores up as you get up into the parks, and as you get down to the lowlands, which are much more converted, have lower scores. An interesting thing here on the coast is that a lot of this is actually in good condition, but the outlets are so much cooler than even just some of these only a little bit inland headwaters. So again, you have that sort of a penalty at the higher scale where these guys don't get a very high score simply because there's not much of a climatic gradient. So these values, as you can see, if you're working in the lowlands, for example, this isn't going to be that interesting to you because you don't have many high-value riparian stretches in the lowlands. And in fact, it's really in these flat, hot, and really highly modified lowlands that these corridors would be most useful to species. And so ultimately, we calculated these quintiles by ecoregion as well. And so now you can see, for example, along the coast here, you can see the top 20% value stretches in blue and the lowest in beige. And so that provides a lot more, this is probably a safer bet if you're looking at a more local scale management or local scale processes. But if you're looking at the whole Pacific Northwest and thinking very broad scale, large landscape management, you might want to look at the previous results for the whole Northwest. The other thing we did was we also calculated the average score, the average index value for all of the headwaters in a HUC. So, for example, these polygons now are HUC 12s, and you can see the average index value for these HUC 12s. So if you're interested in looking at a sort of a watershed scale for prioritization, you might want to use this instead. And then finally, we also can look at the index value, sort of do a little bit more sensitivity testing or just get a little better sense of what's under the hood by removing certain parameter values to see how it changes the index. And so, for example, earlier slides, if you looked at that map, it looks a lot like the map of temperature in the Northwest as well. But if you take out temperature, it actually gives you fairly similar results for all of the reasons I talked about with positive correlations between condition and canopy cover and gradient. The difference being really here on the coast. You pick up a lot more a lot more riparian stretches along the coast that don't have much of a climatic gradient or have a negative gradient, but are otherwise in great shape. And this is good information. Yes, we want climatic gradients to make sure things can move, but there's a lot of you might use this for something other than perhaps we even intended, and so there's valuable information in here other than looking at the climatic gradient of these riparian areas. And ultimately, we didn't provide necessarily every layer that we've sort of been looking at and playing with. We provided what we thought were sort of the key data layers, but we do welcome feedback if folks want to see some additional data layers that might be in the report but aren't online. Then my email is at the end of the presentation, and please just contact me and we can put more layers up. But what we did provide, provided some layers and also just a really in-depth attribute table where you can see layers. So the kinds of things that are in that attribute table and layers that we provided are the streamlines and the potential riparian areas and the huck boundaries that formed sort of the base layers of our analysis. We provided those parameter base layers for the final index values, those points attributed to headwaters are averaged across all the scales, and we provided it with and without change in temperature used in the calculation. We provided the index values calculated at each individual huck level. So if you're not as interested in sort of thinking about large-scale Pacific Northwest-wide processes and you're really focused on just like a Huck 12 local scale management question, you might just want to see the index value calculated at the Huck 12 scale alone and not averaged across all the nested Huck levels. We provided those polygons, the index values averaged within the Huck, so if you want to look at prioritization at a watershed scale, you can do that. And then also those quintiles by ecoregion, in case you are working in lowland areas and you don't just want to see low scores, you actually want to see the best available within your lowland region. Here's where you can find the report and the data layers at nplcc.databasin.org. It's actually on a couple different places as well, but this is probably the easiest place to find it right now. And I'm going to say now a few words about using the Climate Corridor Index. The key layers, and we provided these, would be whatever index value you decide to look at whatever scale. You also want the potential riparian, the Huck boundaries, and the streamlines. And that's what's here. And once you have these, you have to, right now you need to sort of make that mental leap that what you're seeing here, this headwater score, applies to all of the downstream potential riparian, whether you're looking at a single Huck scale and it's the score just from here down to this outlet, or whether it's from here all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, whatever scale you're looking at. It's not just this point here. So you need to make that distinction. And then in terms of taking it from the data to actually using it, this, of course, is just a model, and all models are wrong, and so you might want to at least start by looking at Google Earth. Is it really looking like it's potential riparian at all? Even if something else is there, does it look like it could support riparian vegetation? Is it in the condition that we thought it was in? Does it span the gradient that we said it was in? So there needs to be a certain level of validation on your own for whatever area you're interested in. You could certainly compare it to other relevant values to see if it lines up with your expectations, and certainly some field validation. So again, just a pretty huge caveat that this is a large-scale model. We were trying to get a really good first picture of what is out there and areas you might look, and that's really the intention, is to point you to places that deserve some further investigation. This is not supposed to be the answer. Some analysis take-homes. Again, this is intended to provide sort of a climate lens for management decision-making and conservation planning. And so that could be as an additional layer for analyses or tools like the chat, or maybe incorporation into state wildlife action plans, using it to help inform where you might prioritize restoration. So, for example, if you took out the landscape condition layer and you compared it with values with it included, you could see riparian areas that in all other respects look really hopeful as climate adaptation opportunities or resilience opportunities, but they're in bad shape, and you could make a choice about whether you want to go there or not. Again, guiding things like easements, other acquisitions, and of course to compare with other analyses. So how does it line up with other analyses, other attempts to sort of incorporate climate change values into what you've already done. And the users could be anything from agencies, tribes, NGOs. It's really not, it was not intended for any specific user group. And I know that at least here in Washington, our aquatics folks at WDFW were just as interested in this as the terrestrial folks, because there are a lot of umbrella values in there, like the solar insolation, and actually pretty much all of the parameter values should have some umbrella value for aquatics. Again, this analysis actually does not rely on projections of future climate, so the climate gradient approach is very much a coarse filter approach that's assuming it's based on sort of basic ecological principles and rules of thumb that, generally speaking, things are going to need to move from warmer to cooler areas as climate warms, and they'll have an easier time doing that if the place they're moving through is in good condition and it acts as a good as highly permeable. So this is just an example of, for those of you who are sort of wary of the uncertainty in using projections of future climate, this is one approach that does not rely on them, though of course our assumptions have some uncertainty and the data layers themselves have uncertainty, so you can't escape it. And this ultimately, we're providing an approach that is not at all specific to the Pacific Northwest. This could easily be applied elsewhere. And in fact, we are. So over the next year, we're going to be expanding our extent into western Montana, the area here in gold. And we're also doing a transboundary pilot. So I said we really had to stop at the border there because of data issues, gaps, inconsistencies, and we're going to be developing an approach for dealing with some of that over the next year, with the hope of eventually being able to do a whole sort of Western North America analysis in coming years. We also want to improve usability. So right now the scores are attributed to the headwaters, and you sort of have to make that leap, as I said, to realize what you're looking at when you see that point is really the score for everything downstream of it. And so we want to consider options for attributing those scores to the riparian area itself. So as a raster or a polygon, and the idea, there's some information trade-off there, because at higher order streams you'd be looking at some kind of average of all the scores of those headwaters, but we are considering that because we recognize that looking at a bunch of points, it's not necessarily intuitive that we're talking about these downstream riparian areas. And finally, we're doing some model validation. So we have a student looking at some high-definition aerial photography at some random points in the Northwest to see whether the areas that we've identified actually meet some of the parameters that we can measure. So do they have the degree of human modification that our model suggests, and the level of canopy cover that we expect. So we do have some model validation going on, though of course we can't necessarily anytime soon validate that they're going to do what we want them to do. So I just want to say thanks to our support from Washington, DFW, Idaho, Fish and Game, the Great Northern, North Pacific, and Wilberforce Foundation. If you have any questions, please, and for those leaving, I have questions for you. So if you have a moment, don't get off yet. If you have questions for me, you can email me at mkrosby@uw.edu, and again, you can go to nplcc.databasin.org to find those layers. And let me do a time check here, but I did have questions for you. And so as those on the phone feel comfortable, it's really helpful for us to know things like what decisions you make that could be informed by this analysis, or that you think you might use this analysis for. Which of these layers or products I described might you actually use, which could be useful for you, and how? Do you have any questions about our approach? Does it seem appropriate? And what refinements would you like to see in future iterations of the model? This is definitely not supposed to be an academic exercise. We want this to be used. So, and as much as anyone is comfortable addressing these, I would love to hear from you.
Thank you, Meade. So this is a time, anyone who has questions for Meade about the presentation or any other project results or the question that she has for you. If anyone would like to answer these, now's the time to please ask them.
And you'll have to, is everyone unmuted as well?
Right, so you'll need to unmute yourself because we were not able to globally mute people, so. And if you muted yourself, hit *6 again to unmute yourself. Oh, also, you can send a question in via chat if you'd like, and so we'll be able to read that. So that's another opportunity. I'll ask a first question. One of the results of this work is a landscape-level view that identifies important habitats relative to climate change. So how does this work effort compare to other large-scale assessments that identify important habitats, like PNC's ecoregional assessments and their Resilient Landscape Initiative, or other efforts that have gone on here in the Northwest?
Yeah, so we haven't yet compared it formally to any of these other analyses. I can say anecdotally that I work with the Washington Wildlife Habitat Connectivity Working Group, and we've completed recently some pretty local scale analyses of key corridors in the Columbia Plateau, and these riparian areas, they just lit up immediately. They're some of the only corridors really, especially climate gradient corridors in the Columbia Plateau, especially certain parts of the interior and east of the plateau. And so that was actually really heartening to see that it was just sort of validating our rationale and methods. But I haven't formally looked to compare yet, but that is something that we want to do.
Great, thank you.
I have a question. This is Lynn Halbert with Washington Fish and Wildlife, and it's sort of about the methodology, Meade. So you talked about that you guys did not use future climate projections deliberately, but I'm just sort of curious because it seems like a indicator of resilience for these corridors would be the resilience of the stream itself in terms of its vulnerability to future climate change and its the accessibility to snowpack, things like that. So I'm wondering if that came up at all or how you guys dealt with that.
We didn't talk necessarily about the stream itself. I mean, if only because that is true. So there will be, whether it's rain dominated or continues to be snow dominated, will have a big effect probably on the temperature of the riparian area. But a lot of the parameters we looked at are ones that are most important for determining things like cold water refugia, like solar insolation. And so, yeah, we didn't look from the stream up. We have talked a lot about upland areas and the importance of incorporating upland values into this because there's a lot to think about in terms of, well, okay, so you can facilitate things moving upward, but what's up there when they get there? It could be in terrible condition, or it could be, an area that's going to have a big transition. Do we want to promote that? So we've talked about all of these things. We just haven't necessarily gone there yet. So this is a first iteration of this, and there's a lot more we could look at. But we did want to keep things kind of simple to begin with, at least.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is Johan Hogevorst. I work with the Willamette National Forest, and I'm an aquatic specialist. And when I'm looking and listening to this, it seems like it has more applications to terrestrial species as opposed to aquatic. Was it intended initially to do that or to do both, terrestrial and aquatic?
So I would say the priority was certainly thinking about terrestrial. This wasn't directed towards aquatics, but we just recognized that there were umbrella values here. So certainly a lot of the things we looked at regarding riparian sort of health and resiliency should contribute to of adjacent aquatic habitats. So yeah, the priority was really terrestrial, recognizing that there would be value for aquatics.
Great, thanks. One suggestion, if it does ever expand more into the aquatic realm, is that the groundwater influence on streams is really important to just adaptability and resiliency over time.
Thanks. That's helpful.
we received a question via chat, and the question is, are you aware of ongoing U.S. Forest Service work and the SSN and STARS spatial modeling on stream network? Seems like a lot of potential to merge the two efforts and combine temperature predictions with this work on mapping resiliency.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. So I guess I'm more familiar with the Norwest model and the work that they're doing, looking at changes in stream temperatures over time and trying to identify resilient areas. And yeah, that's something that would be really interesting to do in the future, to compare how those line up. And again, I really would like to suggest that this is one layer that really should be comparative results like that to ultimately make decisions. I fully expect you'll find areas where there's a lot of agreement and areas where there's a lot of disagreement, and there's going to have to be a lot of thought involved in deciding what that means in terms of making decisions. But we look forward to doing that.
So, Meade, this is Steve Buttrick with the Nature Conservancy.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, and this is fascinating. I'm trying to figure out how I would apply it or use it to evaluate how well connected or potentially well connected portfolio sites or conservation sites are. So if I had 3 sites, how would I be able to use this in order to see how well connected they are via riparian areas?
Yeah, I think you would probably look at, I mean, the easiest way to think about it off the top of my head would be sort of a, classic patch corridor kind of approach, and just look at your areas and see if there are any, what are the values, the index values for the riparian areas between them, and, do any of them really, are they connected by stretches of potential riparian, and if so, are they high value ones? And maybe those are areas you want to take a look at as being potentially valuable corridors. And again, thinking about that not being as necessarily the only corridors between them, but as one of like a suite of ways of connecting those areas. So that's probably how I would do it. I mean, you could do that in a number of scales. I presented sort of several different scales at which you could do this, whether looking at just watersheds themselves or the corridors themselves. And there is so we really struggled with how explicitly to incorporate connectivity into this analysis. We tried a lot of different ways of explicitly putting connectivity into this. And right now, it's just kind of implicitly in there in terms of many of the things we looked at will contribute to connectivity in terms of the level of human modification and the score and the gradient and things like that. But the scaling actually also will pick up on connectivity. So something that gets a high score from the 6-field huck to a first-field huck is probably pretty well connected along the stretch. And so that's probably a longer answer than you were thinking about, but I'd probably do kind of a simple overlay to start to see what kind of riparian values there are between those patches.
Okay. So is it possible to you have the origination marked in terms of what the index is? Is it possible to somewhere down the road click on one of those dark blue dots and find that riparian area traced all the way down to?
That's a great idea. You're getting dangerously close to a tool description there, and we haven't talked about doing that, but that would make it really usable, and that actually would solve some of my problems. It's funny, we actually hadn't considered that, but it would solve my sort of discomfort with coming up with average value along the streamline or the riparian stretch. That would be really cool. Yeah, I'm gonna look into that.
Meade, there was a question from Graham Watt. Can you see that in the chat box, or do you need me to read that?
I cannot see it.
The transboundary extension does not seem to. Sorry, the thing just went down. Okay, there we go. The transboundary extension does not seem to incorporate the Okanagan Cayman, sorry for my pronunciation, watersheds. Is there a reason you're focusing on the Columbia Basin Trust area, or would you be interested in moving west? We're trying to break down some of the silos in the upper Columbia.
Yeah, so that came really from our sponsor. So Wilberforce is funding this next round of analysis, and the Columbia Plateau is not a priority region for them. So that's why we're doing the region that we are. We're trying to get into areas that they are working in. But the idea is, though, that this is just a pilot, and if it goes well, then this is supposed to be completed by March, and then the following year we would be looking for follow-up funding, probably a larger, that'll take some effort to sort of get some partners together for that, but we would be trying to go west-wide, which would cover more of the area that you're thinking about. So that's kind of a ways off, but in the short term, no, we're not going there, unfortunately.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for joining today. And maybe Meade, does anyone have any of the answers to the questions that Meade put up? Does anyone want to offer some comments there right now? Or you can send them to her, and she will move to the slide soon that provides her email, and you're welcome to just later on send her the comments.
Yeah, there's about 10 minutes left, and if anybody does, I can't tell you how much I want to know what decisions people are making that could be informed by this work. It's just incredibly helpful for us to know that as we refine this to make it more usable for folks. So I'll leave folks with that question. If anyone wants to stay on and just rattle off what you're doing and what you think you might use this for, or even why you called in because you thought it might be useful for what you do, that would be really helpful. And otherwise, you can also mail that to me at mkrosby@uw.edu.
Meade, this is Steve Buttrick again, and I had to step out a little bit during your presentation. And did you mention about the availability of this data?
Yeah. Here you go.
Ah, okay.
Oh.
And again, folks find that there are we put up what we thought were just the most essential layers. There's probably more that people would want, and so feel free to contact me if you find there are things that are not up there that you would like to be up there. But we did provide a very detailed attribute table, and so our hope was that people would be able to create layers that they might want to see. But if you find that you can't, then just get in touch.
Maybe, Meade, if you want to move to your contact slide so everyone will have that. And we can keep this line open for anyone who wants to talk specific about your work with Meade. Feel free to stay on right now and have that conversation.
Thank you, Meade.
Thank you, Meade. Very cool.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. And Meade will stay on right now, so feel free to stay. Thank you. We'll end the webinar.